What would you do if your father gave you away to pay for his mistake, to a man feared across the north as a savage warrior? That's what happened to Astrid. But the truth of what followed was nothing like anyone expected. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The cold wind swept across the rocky cliffs of the northern coastline, carrying with it the salty spray of the turbulent sea below. The sky above was a tapestry of gray and silver, heavy clouds threatening to unleash their burden upon the land at any moment. The year was 872, and the world of the Northmen was one of conquest, honor, and the unyielding law of strength. Along the jagged shoreline of what would one day be called Norway, a small settlement clung to existence, its wooden structures huddled together as if seeking warmth from one another against the harsh elements that surrounded them. In this unforgiving land, a young woman named Astrid stood at the edge of her father's hall, her fingers gripping the rough wooden frame of the doorway as she stared out at the horizon. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the dread that had settled over her like a heavy cloak. She was 20 years old, with hair the color of honey that fell in waves past her shoulders, and eyes as blue as the fjords that cut through the mountains. Her face was delicate yet strong, with high cheekbones and a determined jaw that spoke of the resilience she had inherited from generations of survivors. She wore a simple woolen dress, dyed a deep green, with a leather belt cinched at her waist. Over her shoulders, she had draped a thick cloak lined with fur, a necessary protection against the biting wind that never seemed to cease in these northern lands. Astrid's father, Bjorn, was the chieftain of their small settlement, a man who had once been respected for his wisdom and fairness. But time and misfortune had worn him down, transforming him from a leader into a desperate man willing to make terrible decisions to preserve what little power he still held. 3 months ago, during a raid on a neighboring settlement, Bjorn had made a grave error in judgment. He had led his warriors into an ambush, resulting in the deaths of several men and the loss of valuable resources. The settlement he had attacked belonged to Jarl Erik, a powerful Viking leader whose reputation for ruthlessness was known throughout the region. Jarl Erik had demanded compensation for the attack, a weregild that would satisfy the honor debt Bjorn had incurred. But Bjorn's settlement was poor, their stores depleted by a harsh winter and failed harvests. He had nothing of value to offer except one thing, his daughter. And so, in a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days, Bjorn had agreed to give Astrid to one of Erik's warriors as payment for his transgression. The warrior chosen was a man named Ragnar, Erik's most feared champion, a giant of a man with a reputation for violence and an appetite for battle that seemed insatiable. The news had reached Astrid 3 days ago, delivered by her father with eyes that couldn't meet hers, with words that stumbled over themselves in their haste to escape his mouth. She had listened in stunned silence as he explained that she would be leaving at dawn, that she would be taken to Jarl Erik's territory and given to Ragnar as his thrall, his property. The word had felt like a blade piercing her heart. Thrall, slave. She would no longer be Astrid, daughter of Bjorn, a free woman with choices and dreams. She would be nothing more than an object, a piece of property to be used and discarded at the whim of her new master. Now, as she stood at the threshold of the only home she had ever known, Astrid felt the weight of her fate pressing down upon her with crushing force. Behind her she could hear the sounds of the settlement waking to the new day, the crowing of roosters, the lowing of cattle, the voices of women calling to their children. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, sounds that spoke of a life she would no longer be part of. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her break, not after what he had done. The door behind her creaked open, and she heard her father's heavy footsteps approaching. Bjorn was a tall man, though age had begun to stoop his shoulders and thin his once powerful frame. His hair, which had once been a vibrant red, was now streaked with gray, and his face was lined with the marks of too many hard years and harder decisions. He stopped beside her, his presence a looming shadow that she refused to acknowledge. "Astrid," he said, his voice rough and uncertain, "the ship will be here soon. You should prepare yourself." She didn't turn to look at him, keeping her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where sea met sky. "I am prepared," she said, her voice cold and flat. "What more preparation does a slave need?" Bjorn flinched at her words, his hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, then falling back to his side. "You must understand," he began, the familiar refrain she had heard too many times already. "I had no choice. If I hadn't agreed to Eric's terms, he would have returned with his warriors and destroyed us all. This way, at least the settlement survives. At least your mother and your brothers will live." Finally, Astrid turned to face him, and the look in her eyes made him take a step back. "You had a choice," she said, each word sharp and precise. "You chose to value your pride over the lives of your men. You chose to attack Eric's settlement when you knew you couldn't win. And now you choose to sacrifice me to save yourself from the consequences of your own foolishness. Don't speak to me of having no choice, Father. You have made nothing but choices, and all of them have been wrong." Bjorn's face flushed with anger and shame, his jaw clenching as he struggled to find words to defend himself. But before he could speak, a shout rose from the settlement's watchtower. "Ship approaching from the south!" The words sent a chill through Astrid's body. They were here. The Vikings from Eric's territory had come to claim her, to take her away from everything she knew and deliver her into a life of servitude and suffering. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, forcing her mind to focus on what needed to be done. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would face this with whatever dignity she could muster. Within minutes, the settlement was alive with activity. Men rushed to the shore, hands on their weapons, though everyone knew there would be no fighting today. This was a transaction, an exchange of property to settle a debt. Astrid walked down to the rocky beach with measured steps, her mother and two younger brothers following behind her. Her mother, Sigrid, was weeping quietly, her face buried in her hands, while her brothers, both barely old enough to hold swords, looked at her with confusion and fear. The ship that approached was a magnificent longship, its carved dragon head rising proudly from the prow, its striped sail billowing in the wind. As it drew closer to shore, Astrid could see the warriors aboard, their shields lined along the sides of the vessel, their weapons gleaming in the pale morning light. These were men hardened by battle, their faces scarred and weathered, their eyes cold and calculating as they assessed the settlement before them. The ship's hull scraped against the rocky beach as it came to rest, and the warriors began to disembark, their movements efficient and practiced. They wore leather armor reinforced with iron rings, thick fur cloaks to ward off the cold, and carried axes, swords, and spears with the casual familiarity of men who lived by violence. At their head was a man who could only be Ragnar. Astrid had heard stories of Ragnar the Fierce, tales of his prowess in battle, of the men he had killed, of the raids he had led, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of him. He stood at least a head taller than any other man on the beach, his shoulders broad and powerful, his arms thick with muscle earned through years of wielding heavy weapons. His hair was dark, almost black, hanging past his shoulders in thick waves, and his beard was long and plaited in the style of the Northmen. His face was striking, with strong features, a sharp nose, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see everything and miss nothing. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a mark of some past battle that had nearly claimed his life. He wore a coat of mail over his leather tunic, the iron rings glinting in the light, and at his belt hung a magnificent sword with a hilt wrapped in leather and inlaid with silver. On his back was a round shield painted red with a black raven in the center, and in his hand he carried a bearded axe, its blade honed to a razor's edge. He was, without question, the most formidable man Astrid had ever seen, and the sight of him filled her with a terror she struggled to suppress. Ragnar's eyes swept over the assembled villagers, dismissing them with barely a glance, until his gaze settled on Astrid. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable, and she forced herself to meet his eyes, refusing to look away despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Bjorn stepped forward, his movements stiff and formal. "I am Bjorn, chieftain of this settlement," he announced, his voice carrying across the beach. "I have agreed to the terms set by Jarl Eric. My daughter Astrid is yours as payment for the debt I owe." Ragnar's gaze shifted to Bjorn, and something like contempt flickered across his features. "You offer your own daughter as payment for your mistakes," he said, his voice deep and rough, like rocks grinding together. What kind of man does such a thing? The question hung in the air. and Bjorn's face reddened with shame and anger. "A man who seeks to protect his people," he replied, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Eric demanded compensation. "This is what I have to give." Ragnar snorted, a sound of disgust, and turned his attention back to Astrid. He walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, and she held her ground, her chin raised, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. When he stood before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, he reached out and took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up to examine her more closely. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers calloused, but not harsh, and Astrid felt a strange jolt of something she couldn't quite identify. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not entirely gray but flecked with blue, and there was an intelligence in them that she hadn't expected. He studied her face for a long moment, then released her and stepped back. "She will do," he said, though whether he was speaking to Bjorn or to himself, Astrid couldn't tell. He turned to his men. "Prepare to depart. We return to Eric's hall before nightfall." The finality of his words struck Astrid like a physical blow. This was it. In moments she would be taken aboard that ship and carried away from her home, perhaps forever. She turned to her mother, who rushed forward and embraced her tightly, sobbing against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Sigrid whispered, her voice broken with grief. "I'm so sorry, my darling girl. May the gods protect you." Astrid held her mother close, feeling the wetness of tears on her own cheeks now, the dam she had built finally breaking. "Tell my brothers I love them," she managed to say, her voice choked. "Tell them to be strong." Her mother nodded, unable to speak further, and Astrid gently pulled away. She looked at her brothers, both of them crying openly now, and gave them what she hoped was a reassuring smile. Then she turned to her father. Bjorn stood apart from the others, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, and for a moment, Astrid almost felt pity for him. Almost. "Goodbye, father," she said simply, and the words carried all the weight of her disappointment, her anger, and her sorrow. Before Bjorn could respond, Ragnar's hand closed around her upper arm, not roughly but with undeniable authority. "Come," he commanded and began walking toward the ship, pulling her along with him. Astrid stumbled on the rocks but quickly regained her footing, forcing herself to keep pace with his long strides. Behind her she could hear her mother's wails growing fainter, the sound carrying across the beach like the cry of a wounded animal. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she would fall apart completely, and she needed whatever strength she had left to face what was coming. Ragnar lifted her bodily into the ship as if she weighed nothing, then climbed in after her. His warriors were already at their positions, ready to push off from the shore. At Ragnar's command, they heaved the ship backward into deeper water, then jumped aboard with practiced ease. The oars came out, and within moments, they were moving away from the beach, away from Astrid's home, away from everything she had ever known. She stood in the center of the ship, surrounded by warriors who paid her no attention whatsoever, their focus on the task of rowing. Ragnar had moved to the stern, where he stood with the steersman, his eyes on the horizon ahead. Astrid found a place to sit on one of the cross benches, pulling her cloak tighter around herself against the cold wind that whipped across the open water. As the ship cut through the waves, carrying her toward an unknown future, Astrid allowed herself to truly feel the full weight of her despair. She had been cast out by her own father, given away like livestock to settle a debt. She was alone, completely alone, at the mercy of a man whose reputation suggested he had no mercy to give. The life that awaited her would be one of servitude, of endless labor, of submission to a master who would use her however he saw fit. It was a fate worse than death, and yet she had no choice but to endure it. The journey across the water seemed to last forever and no time at all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, though it brought little warmth, and the coastline changed from the familiar cliffs of her homeland to new terrain she didn't recognize. Ragnar's warriors rode in steady rhythm, their movements synchronized, their strength seemingly inexhaustible. Occasionally, one of them would glance in her direction, but none spoke to her, and she was grateful for the silence. It was late afternoon when the ship finally approached their destination. Astrid saw a large settlement sprawled along the shore, much bigger than her father's village, with dozens of buildings clustered together around a massive central hall. The hall was an impressive structure, its roof supported by great carved pillars smoke rising from the holes in its thatched roof. Around it were smaller dwellings, workshops, storage buildings, and animal pens. People moved about the settlement in the purposeful way of a community that knew its business, and even from a distance, Astrid could sense the wealth and power that resided here. This was Jarl Eric's domain, and it was clear that he commanded far more resources than her father ever had. The realization only deepened her sense of helplessness. There would be no rescue, no escape. She was entering a world where she had no allies, no friends, no one who cared whether she lived or died. The ship glided into the settlement's harbor, where several other longships were already moored. Warriors on the shore called out greetings to Ragnar's crew, and the men aboard shouted back, their voices carrying across the water. As soon as the ship was secured, Ragnar's warriors began disembarking, eager to return to their families and their own affairs after days at sea. Ragnar approached Astrid, his shadow falling over her where she sat. "Stand," he commanded, and she obeyed, her legs stiff from sitting in the cold for so long. He gestured toward the shore. "Welcome to your new home, Astrid, daughter of Bjorn. From this day forward, you belong to me. You will serve me, obey me, and do as you are told without question. If you prove yourself useful, you will be treated fairly. If you cause trouble, you will be punished. Do you understand?" Astrid met his eyes, seeing no cruelty there but no kindness either, only a cold statement of fact. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. He nodded, apparently satisfied, then turned and walked toward the shore. Astrid followed, her feet touching the unfamiliar ground of her new prison, and wondered if she would ever feel free again. The settlement was bustling with activity as Ragnar led Astrid through its winding paths. Warriors moved about with purpose, their weapons clanging against their sides, while women carried baskets of goods and children ran between the buildings, their laughter cutting through the crisp air. The smell of smoke, roasting meat, and the sea permeated everything, creating an atmosphere that was both foreign and overwhelming to Astrid's senses. She walked behind Ragnar, her eyes taking in every detail of this place that would now be her prison, searching for any information that might prove useful in the days to come. The great hall loomed before them, its massive doors carved with intricate designs depicting battles and legends of the gods. Two warriors stood guard at the entrance, their spears crossed, but they immediately moved aside when they saw Ragnar approaching, nodding respectfully to him. He pushed open the heavy doors without breaking stride, and Astrid followed him into the dimly lit interior. The hall was enormous, far larger than any building Astrid had ever seen. The ceiling soared high above, supported by great wooden pillars carved with serpents and ravens. A long fire pit ran down the center of the hall, flames crackling and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Long tables lined both sides with benches where dozens of warriors could sit for feasts. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sat a massive chair carved from dark oak, and in that chair sat a man who could only be Jarl Erik. Erik was perhaps 50 years old, his hair and beard still thick but streaked with gray. His face was weathered and scarred, the face of a man who had spent his life fighting and had survived where others had fallen. His eyes were sharp and calculating, missing nothing as they swept over Astrid with an assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. He wore fine clothes, a tunic of deep blue wool trimmed with fur, and around his neck hung several thick gold chains, symbols of his wealth and status. Ragnar approached the Jarl's seat and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect from one warrior to his leader. "Jarl Erik," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "I have returned with the payment Bjorn promised, his daughter Astrid, as settlement for the debt he owes." Erik leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving Astrid. "Come closer, girl," he commanded, his voice rough with authority. Astrid's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to walk forward, stopping a few paces from the raised platform. She kept her chin raised, refusing to appear weak before this man who now held power over her fate. Erik studied her for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Bjorn's daughter," he mused. "I have heard she was beautiful, and the reports were not exaggerated. Tell me, girl, do you know why you are here?" "Yes, Jarl," Astrid replied, keeping her voice steady. "My father made an error in judgment when he attacked your settlement. I am here as payment for that debt." "An error in judgment," Erik repeated, amusement coloring his tone. "That is a generous way to describe it. Your father is a fool who led his men into an ambush and got several of them killed. He owes me far more than one daughter could ever repay, but I am a merciful man. I accepted his offer because Ragnar here needed a woman to manage his household, and I thought perhaps Bjorn's daughter might serve that purpose. He turned his attention to Ragnar. She is yours, as we agreed. Use her as you see fit. If she proves troublesome, you have my permission to discipline her however you deem necessary. If she proves useful, perhaps in time she can earn some small measure of freedom. That is up to you. Ragnar nodded. Thank you, Jarl. I will take her to my dwelling now and see that she understands her duties. Eric waved his hand dismissively. Go then. And Ragnar, see that you are ready for the council meeting tomorrow. We have much to discuss regarding the raids planned for spring. I will be there, Ragnar assured him, then turned to Astrid. Follow me. They left the great hall, stepping back out into the cold afternoon air. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the settlement. Ragnar led her through a maze of buildings until they reached a dwelling that stood somewhat apart from the others. It was a well-built structure, larger than most of the other homes Astrid had seen, with solid walls of timber and a roof thatched with fresh straw. Smoke rose from a hole in the center of the roof, suggesting a fire burned inside. Ragnar pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. Astrid stepped inside, her eyes needing a moment to adjust to the dim interior. The dwelling consisted of a single large room with a central fire pit, currently burning low. Along the walls were sleeping platforms covered with furs and blankets. There were several chests for storage, a table with 2 benches, and various household items hanging from pegs on the walls. It was Spartan but comfortable, the home of a warrior who spent more time fighting than worrying about domestic comfort. This is my home, Ragnar said, closing the door behind them. And now it is yours as well, for as long as you serve me. You will sleep there. He pointed to a smaller platform in the corner, separated from the main sleeping area by a wooden partition. You will keep the house clean, prepare my meals, wash my clothes, and tend to any other needs I have. In return, you will be fed, clothed, and protected. Do you have any questions? Astrid looked around the dwelling, her new prison, then back at Ragnar. Am I permitted to go outside? She asked. During the day, yes, to fetch water, gather firewood, or purchase supplies from the market. But you are not to leave the settlement, and you are not to speak with anyone about attempting to escape. If you try to run, you will be caught, and the punishment will be severe. Do you understand? I understand, Astrid replied, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. Ragnar studied her for a moment, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression, a brief flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure it had been there at all. There is bread and cheese on the table, and dried meat in that chest. Eat something, then rest. Tomorrow your duties begin in earnest. He moved toward the door, and Astrid felt a sudden surge of panic. Where are you going? She asked before she could stop herself. Ragnar paused, his hand on the door. I have matters to attend to. I will return before dark. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a solid thud. Astrid stood alone in the dwelling, the silence pressing in around her. For a long moment she didn't move, couldn't move, as the full weight of her situation finally crashed down upon her. She was alone, completely alone, in a strange place among people who cared nothing for her. She was property now, a possession, her life no longer her own. The tears she had been holding back finally came, and she sank down onto the nearest bench, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. She cried for the life she had lost, for the freedom she would never have again, for the father who had betrayed her. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was empty and exhausted, her eyes swollen and her throat raw. Then, slowly, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a shuddering breath. Crying wouldn't change anything. She was here, and she had to survive. That was all that mattered now, survival. Astrid rose from the bench and examined her surroundings more carefully. The dwelling was cleaner than she had expected, suggesting that Ragnar either took care of it himself or had someone doing so before she arrived. She found the bread and cheese he had mentioned, along with a pitcher of what appeared to be ale. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early that morning, and she forced herself to take some food. As she ate, she thought about Ragnar. He was not what she had expected. The stories she had heard painted him as a monster, a man who lived only for violence and bloodshed. But the man she had met seemed different, more controlled, more thoughtful. He had not struck her, had not forced himself upon her, had not even spoken to her with cruelty. He had been distant, formal, treating her more like an unwanted responsibility than a prize won through conquest. She didn't know what to make of him, and that uncertainty troubled her. The light outside was fading when the door opened again, and Ragnar returned. He was carrying firewood, which he deposited near the fire pit, before turning his attention to building up the flames. Astrid watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way his hands knew exactly what to do without thought or hesitation. "Have you eaten?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes," Astrid replied. "Good." He finished with the fire, then moved to one of the chests and retrieved a leather pouch. From it he pulled strips of dried meat and some hard bread, which he ate standing up, his eyes distant as if his thoughts were elsewhere. The silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy. Finally, Astrid found the courage to speak. "May I ask you something?" Ragnar glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You may ask. Whether I answer depends on the question." She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Why did you agree to take me? Jarl Erik said you needed someone to manage your household. But surely there are other women in the settlement who could have done that. Women who were already here, who knew the ways of this place. Why accept me as payment for my father's debt?" For a long moment Ragnar didn't respond, and Astrid thought he would simply ignore her question. But then he set down his food and turned to face her fully, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers. "Because I owed Erik a favor," he said simply. "Several months ago during a raid, I was injured badly. Erik could have left me to die, but he didn't. He risked his own life to pull me from the battle and get me to safety. When he asked me to accept you as part of the settlement with your father, I could not refuse him. I pay my debts, just as your father is paying his." The honesty of his answer surprised her, and she found herself seeing him in a slightly different light. "I see," she said quietly. Ragnar tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You are wondering what kind of master I will be," he said, and it wasn't a question. Astrid nodded, not trusting her voice. "I am not a cruel man, Astrid," Ragnar said, his tone matter-of-fact. "But I am not a soft one either. I will expect you to work hard, to follow my commands, and to cause no trouble. If you do these things, I will treat you fairly. I will not beat you without cause, I will not starve you, and I will not force myself upon you. You are here to manage my household, nothing more. Do you understand?" The relief that washed through Astrid was so intense it made her knees weak. She had been terrified that he would claim her in the way that masters often claimed their female thralls, using her body as another piece of property to exploit. The fact that he had explicitly stated he would not do so lifted a weight from her shoulders she hadn't realized she was carrying. "I understand," she said, and for the first time since arriving in this place, she felt a small glimmer of something that might have been hope. Ragnar nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his meal. After a few moments, he spoke again. "Tomorrow, I will introduce you to some of the other women in the settlement. They can show you where to get water, where the market is, and how things work here. You will need to learn quickly. Winter is coming, and there is much work to be done to prepare." "I will learn," Astrid assured him. She had always been a quick study, and she was determined to prove that she could be useful, that she could earn her keep. Perhaps in time she might even earn enough of Ragnar's trust to have some small measure of freedom within this new life. As the evening wore on, they settled into an uneasy coexistence. Ragnar sat by the fire, sharpening his weapons with long, practiced strokes of a whetstone, while Astrid busied herself with tidying the dwelling and organizing the supplies. Neither spoke much, but the silence was less oppressive than before, more like the quiet that comes when two people are simply sharing a space without needing to fill it with words. When full darkness had fallen and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Ragnar rose and moved toward the main sleeping platform. "Get some rest," he told Astrid. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Astrid nodded and made her way to the smaller platform he had indicated earlier. She removed her outer cloak and laid down on the furs, pulling a thick blanket over herself. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the furs soft and warm, and despite everything that had happened, she felt exhaustion pulling at her. As she lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Ragnar settling into his own bed on the other side of the partition, Astrid thought about her future. She was a slave now. Yes, But Ragnar had promised to treat her fairly if she worked hard. That was more than she had dared hope for. Perhaps this life wouldn't be as terrible as she had feared. Perhaps with time, she could find some way to make the best of her situation. She thought of her mother and brothers, wondering if they were thinking of her too, if they were worried about her fate. She hoped they were safe, that her sacrifice had at least accomplished that much. And she thought of her father, the man who had sold her to save himself, and she felt her heart harden against him. She would survive this, she vowed. She would survive and become strong, stronger than he had ever been. And someday, somehow she would prove that she was worth more than the price he had put on her. With those thoughts swirling in her mind, Astrid finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the day. She didn't sleep well, her dreams troubled by images of the journey, of her mother's tears, of Ragnar's stern face. But she slept, and when morning came, she woke to the sound of Ragnar moving about the dwelling, preparing for the new day. He glanced at her as she sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "There is water in the barrel outside for washing," he said. "Get yourself ready. When you're done, there is porridge on the fire for breaking your fast. After that, I'll take you to meet Hilda. She is the wife of one of Eric's warriors and knows everything about running a household here. She will teach you what you need to know." Astrid nodded and quickly rose, moving to gather her things. The morning air was cold as she stepped outside to wash, the water in the barrel icy against her skin, but it helped wake her fully and clear her head. She dried herself quickly and returned inside, where she found a bowl of porridge waiting for her, thick and warm and flavored with honey. She ate quickly, aware of Ragnar's impatience to be moving. When she was finished, he led her out of the dwelling and through the settlement. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. People were already moving about their business, and many of them nodded respectfully to Ragnar as he passed. He acknowledged them with brief nods but didn't stop to talk, his long strides forcing Astrid to hurry to keep up. They arrived at a dwelling similar to Ragnar's, and he knocked firmly on the door. It was opened almost immediately by a woman who appeared to be in her late 30s, with auburn hair braided back from her face and kind brown eyes. She smiled warmly when she saw Ragnar. "Ragnar, what brings you here so early?" she asked. Then her eyes fell on Astrid, and understanding dawned on her face. "Ah, this must be the girl from Bjorn's settlement. Eric mentioned she had arrived." "This is Astrid," Ragnar confirmed. "I need someone to show her how things work here. Help her learn what she needs to know. Eric suggested you might be willing to help." Hilda's smile widened. "Of course. Come in, both of you. I've just made fresh bread, and there's warm ale if you'd like some." They entered Hilda's dwelling, which was notably more decorated than Ragnar's, with woven tapestries on the walls and carved wooden figures on the shelves. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, making Astrid's mouth water despite having just eaten. Hilda gestured for them to sit, but Ragnar shook his head. "I can't stay. I have to meet with Eric and the other warriors this morning, but I'll leave Astrid with you, if that's acceptable. You can bring her back to my dwelling this evening." "That's perfectly fine," Hilda assured him. "We'll have a good day getting to know each other, won't we, Astrid?" Astrid managed a small smile. "Yes, thank you." Ragnar nodded to both of them, then turned and left, the door closing behind him. As soon as he was gone, Hilda's demeanor became even warmer, and she took Astrid's hand gently. "Come, sit down, dear. You must be overwhelmed by all of this. Let's have some bread and talk. I want to hear about you, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about life here." As Astrid sat down at Hilda's table, accepting a piece of warm bread slathered with butter, she felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Hilda seemed genuinely kind, and for the first time since leaving her home, Astrid felt like perhaps she had found someone who might become an ally, maybe even a friend. It was a small thing, but in her current circumstances, small things mattered more than ever. Hilda proved to be exactly what Astrid needed in those first difficult days. Over the warm bread and ale, the older woman listened patiently as Astrid shared carefully edited portions of her story, speaking of her father's mistake and the debt that had brought her here, though she kept her deepest feelings of betrayal and pain locked away. Hilda's eyes were sympathetic and understanding, and she reached across the table more than once to pat Astrid's hand reassuringly. "You're not the first woman to find herself in difficult circumstances," Hilda said gently, "and you won't be the last. But I can tell you this, Astrid. Ragnar is a good man. one of the best among Eric's warriors. You could have ended up in far worse hands. He's fair, he's honest, and he keeps his word. If he's told you he'll treat you well as long as you work hard, then you can believe him. Astrid absorbed these words, wanting desperately to believe them. How long have you known him? She asked. Nearly 15 years now, Hilda replied, settling back in her chair with her cup of ale. He came to Eric's settlement when he was barely more than a boy, perhaps 16 or 17 years old. He had been cast out from his own family's lands after his father was killed in a dispute over territory. Eric saw potential in him and took him in, trained him, made him into the warrior he is today. Ragnar has always been loyal to Eric, and Eric trusts him completely. That's no small thing in this world. She paused to take a sip of her drink, then continued. My husband Leif fights alongside Ragnar often. He says there's no one he'd rather have at his back in battle. Ragnar is fierce when he needs to be, but he's also thoughtful, strategic. He doesn't kill for the joy of it like some warriors do. He fights because that's what's expected of him, what he's good at, but there's more to him than just violence. This description fascinated Astrid, painting a more complex picture of her new master than she had imagined. Why has he never married? She ventured to ask. Surely a man of his status and reputation would have had many offers. Hilda's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. There was a woman years ago. Her name was Ingrid. She was the daughter of another jarl, and Ragnar loved her deeply. They were to be married, but she fell ill during the winter, a fever that wouldn't break. She died just weeks before their wedding day. After that, Ragnar threw himself into fighting, into serving Eric, into anything that would keep his mind occupied. He never spoke of marrying again. I think perhaps his heart died with Ingrid, and he's never been able to resurrect it. The story stirred something in Astrid's chest, an unexpected sympathy for the man who now owned her. To love someone so deeply and lose them, to carry that grief for years afterward, it was a pain she could understand even if she had never experienced it herself. It made Ragnar seem more human, less the fearsome warrior and more a man who had known suffering and learned to live with it. Thank you for telling me this, Astrid said quietly. It helps me understand him better. Hilda smiled. Good. Now let's talk about practical matters. I'll show you where everything is in the settlement, teach you what you need to know about managing Ragnar's household. The work isn't easy, but it's not impossible either, and you'll find that most people here are decent enough, as long as you respect the hierarchy and don't cause trouble. They spent the rest of the morning touring the settlement, with Hilda pointing out the well where water could be drawn, the market area where traders sold goods, the workshops where craftsmen plied their trades. Astrid met several other women, some free and some thralls like herself, and while a few were cold or dismissive, most were friendly enough. Hilda introduced her as Ragnar's new housekeeper, and that association seemed to earn her a measure of respect, which surprised her. Ragnar is well liked here, Hilda explained as they walked. People respect him, trust him. Being associated with him protects you to some degree. Just don't give anyone reason to complain about you, and you should be fine. By midday, Astrid's head was spinning with information. She had learned where to buy flour, how much to pay for fish, which merchant had the best quality wool, and a dozen other details about daily life in the settlement. Hilda took her to the great hall for the midday meal, where warriors and their families gathered to eat together. The hall was crowded and noisy, filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the clatter of dishes and cups. Astrid spotted Ragnar sitting at one of the long tables with several other warriors, deep in conversation. He glanced up as she and Hilda entered, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his companions. There was no warmth in his gaze, but no hostility either, just acknowledgement of her presence. Astrid followed Hilda to a table where other women sat, and they joined them for a meal of roasted pork, bread, and vegetables. The women were curious about her, asking questions about where she came from and how she had ended up in Ragnar's service. Astrid answered carefully, revealing as little as possible while still being polite. She didn't want her story to become gossip fodder, didn't want people knowing the depth of her father's betrayal. Some wounds were too fresh, too raw to expose to strangers. After the meal, Hilda took her to the market, showing her how to select the best vegetables, how to barter with the merchants, how to stretch resources to make them last. It was knowledge Astrid had some familiarity with from helping her mother, but the scale was different here, the variety of goods more extensive. She paid close attention, determined to prove herself capable. As the afternoon wore on, Hilda brought her back to Ragnar's dwelling and helped her take inventory of what supplies were available and what needed to be purchased. The stores were adequate but not abundant, suggesting Ragnar lived simply and didn't waste resources on unnecessary luxuries. "He's not much for decoration or comfort," Hilda observed with a slight smile, "but he's practical. Make sure the fire never goes out completely, keep fresh water available, and always have food prepared for him when he returns. Those are the basics. Beyond that, use your judgment. If you see something that needs doing, do it." Ragnar appreciates initiative. As evening approached, Hilda prepared to leave. She paused at the door, turning back to Astrid with a warm expression. "You're going to be fine, dear. I can see you're strong, resilient. If you need anything or if you just need someone to talk to, come find me. My door is always open to you." "Thank you, Hilda," Astrid said, feeling genuine gratitude. "You've been incredibly kind. I won't forget it." After Hilda left, Astrid set about preparing the evening meal. She had purchased fresh fish at the market, along with onions, cabbage, and some herbs. She built up the fire, filled a pot with water from the barrel outside, and began preparing a stew. The familiar motions of cooking were soothing, giving her something productive to focus on, and she found herself relaxing into the work. She was stirring the pot when the door opened and Ragnar entered, bringing with him the cold evening air and the scent of leather and steel. He closed the door behind him and removed his cloak, hanging it on a peg, then his weapons belt, which he set carefully on one of the chests. His movements were methodical, practiced, the routine of a man who had performed these same actions countless times. "How was your day?" he asked, moving to warm his hands by the fire. The question surprised Astrid. She hadn't expected him to care about her day, to ask about it as if she were a person rather than property. "It was good," she replied, continuing to stir the stew. "Hilda was very helpful. She showed me everything I need to know about the settlement and how to manage your household." Ragnar nodded, settling onto one of the benches. "Hilda is a good woman. Her husband Leif is one of my closest friends. She'll be a valuable friend to you if you let her." "I intend to," Astrid said. She ladled some of the stew into a bowl and brought it to him, along with a piece of bread. "I hope this is acceptable. I'm still learning what you prefer." Ragnar took the bowl and tasted the stew, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded. "It's good. Better than what I usually make for myself." There was the ghost of a smile on his lips, barely visible, but there nonetheless. Astrid felt a small surge of pride at the compliment, however minor it was. She prepared her own bowl and sat on the opposite bench, eating in companionable silence. The stew was indeed good, the fish tender and the vegetables flavored nicely with the herbs she had chosen. It reminded her of meals at home, and for a moment homesickness washed over her so powerfully that she had to blink back tears. "You're thinking of your family," Ragnar observed, his voice neutral but not unkind. Astrid looked up, surprised that he had noticed. "Yes," she admitted. "I can't help but wonder how they are, if they're safe." Ragnar was quiet for a moment, then said, "The debt your father owed has been paid. Eric has no further quarrel with him. As long as Bjorn doesn't do anything foolish again, your family should be safe." The reassurance helped, though it didn't completely ease the ache in Astrid's chest. "Thank you for telling me that." They finished their meal in silence, and afterward, Astrid cleaned the dishes, while Ragnar sat by the fire, working on repairing a tear in one of his leather boots. The domesticity of the scene was strange, almost surreal. Here she was, a thrall in the home of a fearsome Viking warrior, and they were simply existing together, each engaged in their own tasks, like any ordinary household. When the work was done and the fire had burned down to embers, they retired to their separate sleeping areas. As Astrid lay in the darkness, she reflected on how different this day had been from what she had feared. Ragnar had been distant but not cruel, formal but not harsh. He had asked about her day, had reassured her about her family, had even complimented her cooking. These were small things, perhaps, but they suggested that maybe, just maybe, her life here might be bearable. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Astrid woke each morning before Ragnar, built up the fire, and prepared a simple breakfast. After he left to train with the other warriors or attend to whatever business Eric required of him, she would set about her household tasks, fetching water, cleaning, preparing food, mending clothes, and all the other endless work that keeping a home required. She often visited the market, where she became a familiar face among the merchants, and she grew more comfortable navigating the settlement. Hilda remained a steady presence in her life, often stopping by to check on her or inviting her to share a meal. Through Hilda, Astrid met more of the settlement's women and began to understand the complex social dynamics that governed life here. There was a hierarchy among the women just as there was among the men, based on the status of their husbands or masters, their own skills and contributions, and how long they had been part of the community. As a thrall belonging to one of Eric's most respected warriors, Astrid occupied a strange middle ground. She was not free, but she was not treated as lesser by most people. Some of the other thralls seemed envious of her position, while some of the free women seemed to look down on her. Astrid learned to navigate these dynamics carefully, being polite to everyone while avoiding getting drawn into gossip or conflicts. Her relationship with Ragnar remained formal and distant, but a grudging respect began to develop between them. He appreciated that she kept his home clean and orderly, that his meals were well prepared, that she anticipated his needs without being told. She appreciated that he kept his word, treating her fairly, never raising his hand to her, never making demands beyond what was reasonable for household management. They spoke little, their conversations limited to practical matters and occasional brief exchanges about the day's events. But sometimes, in the evenings when they sat by the fire, Astrid would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been curiosity or perhaps loneliness. She never mentioned it, and neither did he, and the moments would pass as quickly as they came. 3 weeks after Astrid's arrival, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing the first real snows of winter. The settlement hunkered down, preparing for the long, dark months ahead. Ragnar and the other warriors spent their days reinforcing buildings, checking supplies, and ensuring that everything was ready for the harsh season. The raids that had been planned for spring were discussed and debated in the Great Hall, strategies formed and reformed as Eric and his war council considered their options. Astrid threw herself into preparations as well, working alongside Hilda and the other women to preserve food, gather firewood, and prepare warm clothing. The work was hard and endless, but she found satisfaction in it, in knowing that she was contributing something of value. She was learning skills she had never needed before, becoming more capable and confident with each passing day. One evening, as a particularly fierce storm howled outside, Ragnar returned to the dwelling covered in snow, his face reddened by the cold. Astrid hurried to help him remove his frozen cloak, bringing him close to the fire and pressing a cup of hot spiced ale into his hands. "The storm is getting worse," he said, his voice rough from the cold. "It's going to be a long night." Astrid nodded, moving to check the supplies of firewood they had stacked inside. "We have enough wood to keep the fire going through the night, and there's plenty of food. We'll be fine." Ragnar looked at her, and this time the expression on his face was clearly one of approval. "You've adapted well to life here," he said. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest. Many would have fought against their circumstances, made things difficult, but you've chosen to make the best of your situation. That takes strength." The compliment warmed Astrid more than the fire did. "I didn't see much point in fighting against something I couldn't change," she replied. "Better to accept reality and find a way to live with it." "Wise words," Ragnar acknowledged. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I know this wasn't the life you chose, Astrid. I know you're here because of your father's failings, not your own. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you were put in this position." It was the first time he had expressed anything like sympathy for her situation, and Astrid felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That means more than you might think." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle inside. Eventually, Ragnar spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "Tell me about your life before you came here. What was it like?" The question caught Astrid off guard, but after a moment's hesitation, she began to speak. She told him about her mother, about her brothers, about the small settlement where she had grown up. She spoke of the daily rhythms of life there, the festivals and celebrations, the stories told around winter fires. She even, though it pained her, spoke of her father, of the man he had been before grief and desperation had changed him. Ragnar listened attentively, asking occasional questions, seeming genuinely interested in understanding who she was beyond just the thrall who managed his household. In turn, he shared some of his own story, speaking briefly of his youth, his training as a warrior, the battles he had fought. He didn't mention Ingrid, and Astrid didn't ask, respecting the privacy of his grief. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, they continued to talk, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. For the first time since arriving in the settlement, Astrid felt like she was being seen as a person, not just a servant. And for the first time she saw Ragnar not as her master, but as a man, complex and layered, carrying his own burdens and scars. When they finally retired to their sleeping areas, Astrid lay awake for a long time, thinking about the evening's conversation. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had begun to crack. She didn't know what it meant or where it might lead, but she found herself hoping that this tentative connection might grow into something more, something that could make her life here not just bearable but perhaps even meaningful. The winter deepened, blanketing the settlement in thick snow that transformed the landscape into a world of white and gray. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder, and life in the settlement slowed to match the season's pace. Warriors spent more time indoors maintaining their weapons and equipment, telling stories of past battles, and planning for the raids that would come with spring's thaw. The women worked tirelessly to keep their households running, spinning wool, weaving cloth, preparing meals, and ensuring that fires stayed lit against the relentless cold. For Astrid, the weeks following that storm-filled evening marked a subtle but significant change in her relationship with Ragnar. Their conversations became more frequent and more personal, moving beyond mere practicalities to encompass thoughts, opinions, and even occasional moments of humor. She discovered that beneath his stern warrior's exterior, Ragnar possessed a sharp intelligence and a dry wit that caught her off guard and sometimes made her laugh despite herself. One afternoon, as Astrid was grinding grain to make flour, Ragnar returned earlier than usual from the great hall. His expression was troubled, his jaw tight with tension. He removed his weapons and cloak with more force than necessary, the movements sharp and agitated. "Is something wrong?" Astrid asked, setting aside her work. Ragnar ran a hand through his hair, then dropped heavily onto one of the benches. "Eric is planning a raid for early spring," he said, his voice carrying a weight of concern. "Against a settlement to the west, one that's known to be well defended. The potential for plunder is significant, but so are the risks. Many of the younger warriors are eager for glory and don't fully understand what they're walking into." Astrid poured him a cup of ale and brought it to him, then sat on the opposite bench. "Are you opposed to the raid?" "Not opposed exactly," Ragnar replied, taking a long drink, "but cautious. I've fought enough battles to know that enthusiasm and bravery aren't enough when you're facing skilled opponents. Eric values my counsel, but some of his other advisors are pushing hard for this raid, seeing only the potential rewards and ignoring the costs. There's a young warrior named Sven, ambitious and reckless, who's been particularly vocal. He challenges my assessments, suggests I've grown too cautious in my years." The frustration in his voice was evident, and Astrid felt sympathy for his position. "What will you do?" "Continue to advise Eric honestly," Ragnar said. "That's all I can do. If he decides to proceed with the raid, I'll fight as I always have. But I won't lie and tell him it's without danger, just to appease the hot-headed fools who think war is all glory and no suffering." Astrid considered his words carefully before speaking. "It sounds like you carry a heavy burden, being responsible not just for your own life in battle, but for counseling others whose lives depend on those decisions." Ragnar looked at her with something like surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to understand. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it is. A burden, one I accepted when I chose this path, but a burden nonetheless." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Astrid said, "For what it's worth, I think your caution comes from wisdom, not fear. The young warrior who challenges you, he hasn't seen what you've seen, hasn't lost what you've lost. He doesn't know yet that survival is sometimes the greatest victory." Ragnar's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "You see clearly, Astrid," he said softly. "More clearly than many warriors I know. How did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise," Astrid replied, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I've just learned to watch and listen, to understand that things are rarely as simple as they first appear." "That is wisdom," Ragnar insisted. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I'm glad you're here, Astrid. Your presence, your perspective, it helps more than you know." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Astrid's heart beat faster, and she found herself unable to look away from his gaze. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility, until finally Ragnar broke eye contact and stood, moving to tend to the fire. "I should prepare for the evening meal," Astrid said, rising as well, needing something to occupy her hands and mind. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Ragnar's presence in the dwelling, of every movement he made, every breath he took. Something was shifting between them, something that went beyond master and servant, beyond captor and captive. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she could feel it growing stronger with each passing day, each shared conversation, each moment of understanding that passed between them. The days that followed were marked by increased tension in the settlement. Eric had decided to proceed with the spring raid, despite Ragnar's concerns, and preparations were underway. Warriors spent their days training intensively, honing their skills with sword, axe, and shield. The sound of clashing weapons echoed through the settlement from dawn until dusk, punctuated by the shouts of men pushing themselves to their limits. Astrid watched from a distance one afternoon as Ragnar trained with several other warriors in the open area near the Great Hall. Even among these skilled fighters, he stood out. His movements were precise and powerful, his strikes devastating, yet controlled. He fought with the confidence of a man who had survived countless battles, and the younger warriors who faced him in practice combat were no match for his experience and skill. She noticed Sven, the ambitious young warrior Ragnar had mentioned, watching from the sidelines with barely concealed resentment. He was perhaps 25 years old, tall and strong, with the arrogance of someone who had never truly been tested. When Ragnar finished his current bout, Sven stepped forward, challenging him to a match. Ragnar accepted with a slight nod, and the two men faced each other, practice weapons at the ready. The clash was fierce from the start, Sven attacking with aggressive fury, while Ragnar defended with patient precision. For several minutes they battled back and forth, and Astrid found herself holding her breath as she watched. Then, with a move so fast she almost missed it, Ragnar disarmed Sven and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The practice sword was at Sven's throat before he could recover, and Ragnar's voice carried clearly across the training ground. "Aggression without strategy is just noise, Sven. In a real battle you'd be dead now." The humiliation on Sven's face was evident as Ragnar helped him to his feet. The younger warrior pulled away roughly, his jaw clenched with anger, and stalked off without a word. Astrid saw the way several other warriors exchanged glances, some amused, some concerned. This was clearly not the first time Ragnar and Sven had clashed, and the animosity between them was palpable. That evening, when Ragnar returned to the dwelling, Astrid could see the tension still coiled in his shoulders. She had prepared a hot bath for him, heating water over the fire and filling the large wooden tub they kept in the corner. It was a luxury she knew he appreciated after long days of training. "Thank you," he said when he saw it, genuine gratitude in his voice. "You anticipate my needs before I even know I have them." "I saw you training today," Astrid admitted as she stirred the stew that was simmering over the fire. "You and Sven both." Ragnar was silent for a moment as he began removing his armor. "He's going to get himself killed," he said finally, his voice heavy with frustration, "and probably take other men with him. He fights with his pride instead of his head." "Can't you talk to him? Make him understand?" "I've tried," Ragnar replied, "but he sees my counsel as an insult to his abilities. He thinks I'm trying to diminish him, to keep him from achieving glory. He doesn't understand that I'm trying to keep him alive." Astrid turned from the fire to look at him. "Then perhaps the only way he'll learn is through experience, as you did." "Perhaps," Ragnar agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. "I just hope that experience doesn't cost him his life." He settled into the hot bath with a sigh of relief, and Astrid busied herself with the evening meal, giving him privacy. But as she worked, she found her thoughts drifting to him, to the concern he felt for his fellow warriors, to the weight of responsibility he carried. She had seen him as a fearsome warrior, then as a fair master, and now she was beginning to see him as something more, a man of honor and compassion who cared deeply about those under his protection. When he emerged from the bath, dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp, Astrid served their meal. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people have grown accustomed to each other's presence. After the meal, as they sat by the fire, Ragnar spoke suddenly. "Tell me, Astrid, if you could choose any life for yourself, what would it be?" The question surprised her, and she took a moment to consider her answer. I don't know, she admitted finally. Before I came here, I never thought much about choice. My life was mapped out for me. I would marry someone my father approved of, bear children, manage a household. It wasn't an exciting future, but it was predictable, safe. Now I don't have even that certainty. But if you could choose, Ragnar pressed, if you were free to decide your own path, what would you want? Astrid looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. I think I would want a life where I mattered, she said slowly, where my thoughts and opinions were valued, where I could contribute something meaningful. I would want to be more than just someone's daughter, or someone's wife, or someone's servant. I would want to be seen for who I am, not just what I can provide. She glanced at Ragnar and found him watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. And what about love? He asked quietly. Would you want that too? I don't know, Astrid answered honestly. I've never been in love. I don't know what it feels like, what it requires. But yes, I suppose I would want that. If it was real, if it was with someone who saw me as an equal partner, rather than a possession. Ragnar was silent for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on her. Then he said, You deserve all of those things, Astrid. You deserve to be valued, to be seen, to be loved. And I'm sorry that circumstances have denied you the freedom to pursue them. The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. Why are you saying this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because it's true, Ragnar replied. And because I want you to know that I see you, Astrid. Not as a thrall, not as a servant, but as a person of worth and intelligence and strength. You've brought something to my life that I didn't know was missing, and I'm grateful for it.
Astrid didn't know how to respond to such words, didn't know how to process the emotions they stirred within her. She had tried so hard to keep her heart guarded, to maintain the distance necessary for survival, but Ragnar's words were breaking down those defenses, making her feel things she had promised herself she wouldn't feel. I should retire, she said abruptly, standing up. It's been a long day.
Ragnar nodded, but she could see disappointment flicker across his face before he masked it. Sleep well, Astrid. As she lay in her bed that night, Astrid's mind raced with confusion and conflicting emotions. She was a slave, property, owned by the man who had just spoken to her with such tenderness and respect. How could she reconcile those two realities? How could she allow herself to care for someone who held such absolute power over her life? And yet, despite all her logical arguments against it, she couldn't deny that she was beginning to care for Ragnar, to see him not as her master, but as a man she could respect, admire, and perhaps even love. The winter solstice came and went, marked by feasting and celebration in the great hall. Eric hosted a massive feast, with tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, dried fruits, and endless supplies of ale and mead. Warriors and their families gathered to celebrate the turning of the year, to honor the gods, and to strengthen the bonds of community that would carry them through the remainder of winter and into the challenges of spring. Astrid attended the feast with Ragnar, sitting beside him at one of the long tables. She wore a new dress that Hilda had helped her make, dyed a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, with silver thread embroidered around the neckline and sleeves. Ragnar had noticed when she emerged wearing it, his eyes widening slightly before he composed himself and offered a simple compliment. Throughout the feast, Astrid was acutely aware of the way Ragnar's presence beside her made her feel protected, valued. He included her in conversations, asked her opinion on matters, and made it clear through his actions that she was more than just his servant. She saw other women looking at her with envy, and some of the men regarding her with curiosity, wondering perhaps at the unusual dynamic between the warrior and his thrall. Sven was also at the feast, drinking heavily and growing louder and more boastful as the evening progressed. He regaled anyone who would listen with tales of his prowess in training, his plans for glory in the spring raid, his certainty that he would return laden with treasure and honor. Astrid saw Ragnar watching him with concerned eyes, but he said nothing, allowing the young warrior his moment of bravado. As the night wore on and the ale flowed freely, the atmosphere in the hall grew more raucous. Some warriors began to sing battle songs, others engaged in friendly wrestling matches, and the noise level rose to near-deafening proportions. Astrid found it overwhelming, the press of bodies, the heat, the smell of sweat and smoke and spilled drink. Ragnar must have noticed her discomfort because he leaned close and spoke into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Would you like to leave? We don't have to stay." Astrid nodded gratefully, and they rose from the table, making their way through the crowded hall toward the doors. As they passed Sven's table, the young warrior called out, his words slurred with drink. "Ragnar, leaving so early? Or are you eager to get your pretty thrall alone?" The comment was crude and insulting, and Astrid felt her face flame with embarrassment. Ragnar stopped, his body going rigid, and turned slowly to face Sven. The hall quieted somewhat, sensing potential conflict. "Watch your tongue, Sven," Ragnar said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your drunkenness is no excuse for disrespect." Sven laughed, though there was an edge to it. "Disrespect? I'm just stating what everyone's thinking. You've grown soft, Ragnar, letting a woman distract you from your duties. Maybe that's why you're so cautious about the raid. You've lost your stomach for real fighting." The insult hung in the air, and Astrid held her breath, waiting to see what Ragnar would do. For a long moment, he simply stared at Sven, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice that carried throughout the now silent hall, he said, "When the raid comes, Sven, I'll be fighting as I always have, protecting the men beside me and securing victory for our Jarl. Where will you be? Dead in the first charge because you were too arrogant to listen to those with more experience? Or running back to the ships because you finally realized that real battle isn't like your boastful stories?" The challenge was clear, and Sven's face flushed dark red. He started to stand, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt, but his companions grabbed his arms, holding him back. Eric's voice boomed from the high table. "Enough! This is a feast, not a battlefield. Save your aggression for our enemies, both of you." Ragnar inclined his head toward Eric, acknowledging the command, then turned and walked out of the hall with Astrid close behind him. The cold night air hit them like a physical blow after the heat of the crowded hall, but Astrid welcomed it, breathing deeply to clear her head. They walked back to the dwelling in silence, but it was a charged silence, heavy with unspoken tension. Once inside, with the door closed behind them, Ragnar began pacing, his anger and frustration evident in every movement. "I shouldn't have let him provoke me," he muttered. "I should have ignored it, walked away. He insulted both of us." Astrid said quietly, "You had every right to respond." Ragnar stopped pacing and looked at her. "He insulted you. That's what made me angry. I don't care what he says about me, but I won't tolerate him speaking of you that way." The protectiveness in his voice sent warmth flooding through Astrid's chest. "Why?" she asked, taking a step toward him. "Why do you care what he says about me?" Ragnar stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with something, some internal battle between what he felt and what he thought he should say. Finally, he closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "Because you matter to me, Astrid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than you should, more than I ever intended. You've become important to me, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Astrid's breath caught in her throat. "Ragnar, But before she could finish, his lips were on hers and all thoughts fled from her mind. The kiss was unlike anything Astrid had ever experienced. It was gentle yet passionate, tender yet urgent, conveying everything that words had failed to express between them over the past months. For a moment she was too shocked to respond, her mind reeling from the sudden shift in their relationship. But then her body took over, her hands moving up to grip his shoulders as she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Ragnar rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though his hands remained on her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You're under my authority. You can't refuse me, and I swore I would never take advantage of that power." Astrid pulled back slightly so she could look into his eyes. "What if I didn't want to refuse?" she asked softly. "What if I wanted this too?" Ragnar's eyes searched hers, looking for truth, for certainty. "Do you? Or do you feel obligated because of your position?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Astrid took a moment to examine her own feelings, to separate what was real from what might be mere gratitude or dependency. What she found surprised her with its clarity. "I care for you, Ragnar," she said, the words coming more easily than she had expected. "Not because you're my master, but because of who you are. You've shown me kindness and respect when you could have shown me cruelty. You've treated me as a person of value when the world would have excused you for treating me as property. You've made me feel seen and heard and important. How could I not develop feelings for you? The vulnerability in her voice seemed to break something in Ragnar. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and holding her as if she were something precious and fragile. I never meant for this to happen, he murmured against her hair. When Eric asked me to take you, I thought it would be a simple arrangement, a debt paid and a household managed. I never expected to find someone who would challenge me, who would make me think and feel and want things I thought I'd buried with Ingrid. The mention of his lost love made Astrid tense slightly, and Ragnar must have felt it because he loosened his hold and looked down at her. I loved Ingrid, he said honestly. I loved her deeply, and when she died, I thought that part of me died with her. I never imagined I could feel this way again, that someone could reach the parts of my heart I thought were forever closed. But you have, Astrid. You've made me feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Tears sprang to Astrid's eyes at his words, overwhelmed by the emotion and honesty in them. I don't want to be a replacement for her, she said, needing him to understand. I don't want to be loved because I remind you of what you lost. You're not, Ragnar assured her, his hands framing her face again. You're nothing like Ingrid. She was gentle and quiet, content with the traditional role of a wife. You're strong and outspoken, full of fire and resilience. You're your own person, Astrid, and it's you I want, not a ghost from my past. The conviction in his voice convinced her, and she reached up to pull him down for another kiss. This one was deeper, more assured, both of them now certain of what they wanted. When they broke apart again, Ragnar took her hand and led her to sit by the fire. We need to talk about what this means, he said, his voice serious. About what we can do, what's possible given your status. Astrid nodded, though a part of her wanted to ignore practical considerations and simply lose herself in the feelings that were flooding through her. I know, I'm still a thrall, still bound to you by law and circumstance. That can change, Ragnar said firmly. I can grant you your freedom. It's within my rights as your master. Once you're free, we can court properly, as equals. And if you still want me then, we can marry. The offer was more than Astrid had dared to hope for, but something in his words gave her pause. If I still want you then? She repeated. Do you think my feelings would change if I were free? Ragnar's expression was troubled. I need to know that you choose me freely, Astrid, not because you feel you have no other option. If I keep you as a thrall while we're together, there will always be that doubt, that question of whether you're with me because you want to be or because you have to be. I can't live with that uncertainty. Astrid understood his concern, but it frustrated her nonetheless. So you would set me free, and then what? Make me wait some arbitrary amount of time to prove my feelings are real? Ragnar, my feelings are real now. They won't become more real just because my legal status changes. Perhaps not, Ragnar conceded. But humor me in this, Astrid. Let me do this the right way, the honorable way. Let me grant you your freedom, and then let me court you as you deserve to be courted, as a free woman of worth and dignity. If, after a reasonable time, you still wish to be with me, then we'll marry with everyone knowing it was your choice, your decision, made freely and without coercion. There was such earnestness in his plea that Astrid couldn't refuse him, even though a part of her worried about what might happen in the interim. How long is a reasonable time? She asked. Until after the spring raid, Ragnar said. I'll grant you your freedom tomorrow in front of Eric and witnesses, so there can be no question about it. Then I'll leave with the raiding party, and while I'm gone, you'll have time to think, to consider what you truly want without my presence influencing you. When I return, if you still want to be with me, we'll announce our intention to marry. It was a sensible plan, one that took into account both their feelings and the need for propriety. But Astrid felt a chill of fear at the thought of Ragnar leaving on the raid, especially given the concerns he'd expressed about its danger. And if you don't return? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ragnar's jaw tightened. I will return. I've survived many raids, many battles. I know how to stay alive. But you said yourself this raid is particularly dangerous, Astrid pressed. That the settlement is well defended, that younger warriors like Sven don't understand the risks. What if something goes wrong? Then you'll be free regardless, Ragnar said, though his tone suggested he didn't like thinking about this possibility. You'll have your freedom and can choose your own path forward. But I don't intend to die, Astrid. I have too much to live for now." The look he gave her was full of promise and determination, and Astrid felt some of her fear ease. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back." "I promise," Ragnar said solemnly. "I will fight with all the skill and cunning I possess, and I will return to you. This I swear." They sat together by the fire for hours, talking about their hopes and fears, their pasts and potential futures. Ragnar told her more about his life before Eric's settlement, about the family he had lost and the path that had led him to become a warrior. Astrid shared her dreams and desires, the things she had never felt safe expressing before. It was a night of revelations and intimacy, of two people truly seeing each other for the first time. When they finally retired to their separate sleeping areas, it was with reluctance, both wanting to stay together but Ragnar insisting on maintaining propriety until Astrid was officially free. As Astrid lay in her bed, her lips still tingling from their kisses, her heart full of emotions she was still processing, she felt hope blooming in her chest for the first time since leaving her father's settlement. Perhaps this new life wouldn't just be bearable, she thought. Perhaps it could be truly happy. The next morning, Ragnar kept his promise. He brought Astrid to the great hall where Eric held court over the settlement's legal matters. The hall was less crowded than during feasts, but there were still dozens of people present, warriors and free folk who had business to attend to or simply enjoyed watching the proceedings. Eric looked up with interest when Ragnar approached with Astrid at his side. "Ragnar, what brings you here this morning?" Ragnar's voice was clear and firm as he spoke. "Jarl Eric, I come before you to formally request the manumission of my thrall, Astrid, daughter of Bjorn. She has served me well and faithfully, and I wish to grant her freedom." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. It wasn't unheard of for thralls to be freed, but it was unusual enough to be noteworthy, especially when the thrall in question had only been in service for a few months. Eric leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes moving between Ragnar and Astrid. "This is unexpected," Eric said. "The girl was given to you as payment for her father's debt. She's valuable property. Are you certain you wish to free her so soon?" "I am certain," Ragnar replied. "She has more than fulfilled any obligation. I wish to grant her freedom with no conditions, no debts attached. She will be a free woman, able to choose her own path." Eric studied them for a long moment, and Astrid thought she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "I see," he said slowly. "Very well. If this is your wish, Ragnar, then let it be done. Astrid, daughter of Bjorn, by my authority as Jarl and with Ragnar's consent as your master, I hereby declare you free. You are no longer bound in servitude. You are a free woman with all the rights and privileges that entails." The formal words washed over Astrid like a wave, and she felt something shift inside her, a weight lifting that she had carried since the day her father had sold her. She was free, truly free. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she had to blink rapidly to keep them from falling. "Thank you, Jarl Eric," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ragnar." Ragnar smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his usually stern face. "You're welcome, Astrid. You earned this freedom through your own efforts and character. No one can take it from you now." As they left the great hall, Astrid felt as if she were walking on air. People congratulated her as they passed, some genuinely pleased for her, others curious about what this development might mean. Hilda was waiting outside and immediately embraced Astrid when she saw her. "I heard what happened," Hilda said, beaming. "Oh, Astrid, I'm so happy for you. This is wonderful news." "Thank you, Hilda," Astrid said, returning the embrace. "I can hardly believe it's real." "It's real," Hilda assured her. "And now you need to decide what you want to do with this freedom. Will you stay in the settlement? Return to your father's lands? Make your own way somewhere new?" Astrid glanced at Ragnar, who was standing a respectful distance away, giving her space to talk with Hilda. "I'm going to stay," she said. "At least for now. I have reasons to remain here." Hilda followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. "I thought as much. Well, you'll need somewhere to live. You can't stay with Ragnar now that you're free, not without being married. It wouldn't be proper." The reality of this hadn't fully occurred to Astrid, and she felt a flash of dismay. Of course, Hilda was right. As a free woman, living with Ragnar without being married would damage her reputation and his. I hadn't thought of that, she admitted. You can stay with Leif and me, Hilda offered immediately. We have room, and I would love the company. You can stay with us until Ragnar returns from the raid, and then, well, we'll see what happens then. The offer was generous and solved an immediate problem. Astrid accepted gratefully, and arrangements were quickly made. By midday, she had moved her few belongings from Ragnar's dwelling to Hilda's, settling into a small but comfortable space that Hilda had prepared for her. That evening, Ragnar came to visit her at Hilda's home. They walked together through the settlement as the sun set, talking quietly about the changes that had occurred and what lay ahead. The spring raid was now only weeks away, and preparations were intensifying. Warriors were making their final arrangements, saying goodbye to families, preparing themselves mentally for the battles to come. I wish you didn't have to go, Astrid said as they paused at the edge of the settlement, looking out over the darkening landscape. I know, Ragnar replied, taking her hand. But this is my duty, my responsibility to Eric and to the men who fight beside me. I can't abandon them. I understand, Astrid said, though understanding didn't make it easier. Just please be careful. Don't take unnecessary risks. I won't, Ragnar promised. He turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face in the now familiar gesture. Wait for me, Astrid. When I return, we'll start our life together properly, the way it should be. I'll wait, Astrid assured him, for as long as it takes. They kissed then, a long, sweet kiss filled with promise and longing. When they finally parted, both were reluctant to let go, but they knew they had to maintain propriety now that Astrid was free. Ragnar walked her back to Hilda's dwelling, kissed her hand formally, and bid her good night. The weeks leading up to the raid passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Astrid kept herself busy helping Hilda with various tasks around the settlement, getting to know the other women better, and establishing herself as a free member of the community. She saw Ragnar regularly, though always in public settings and always maintaining the careful distance appropriate for a courtship. They would talk for hours, sharing meals in the great hall, walking together through the settlement, building the foundation for what they hoped would be a long life together. But always, in the back of Astrid's mind, was the knowledge that soon Ragnar would be leaving, sailing off to face unknown dangers. She tried not to let her fear show, tried to be strong and supportive, but sometimes at night she would lie awake, worrying about all the things that could go wrong. The night before the raid was to depart, Eric held a feast to honor the warriors who would be sailing with him. The great hall was packed with people, the atmosphere charged with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Warriors boasted of the glory they would win, the treasure they would claim, while their wives and mothers tried to maintain brave faces despite their own fears. Astrid sat with Hilda and the other women, watching as Ragnar talked with his fellow warriors, his expression serious and focused. Sven was there too, louder and more boastful than ever, surrounded by young men who fed off his enthusiasm. Astrid noticed that several of the older, more experienced warriors seemed to distance themselves from Sven's group, and she wondered if they shared Ragnar's concerns about the young warrior's recklessness. Later in the evening, Ragnar found her and asked if she would walk with him one more time before he left. They slipped out of the noisy hall into the quiet night, walking to a secluded spot near the shore where they could hear the waves lapping against the rocks. Tomorrow we sail at dawn, Ragnar said, his arm around her shoulders as they stood looking out at the dark water. The journey will take several days, and the raid itself could last anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, depending on how things unfold. I wanted to give you this before I go. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When Astrid unwrapped it, she found a beautifully carved wooden pendant in the shape of a raven, suspended on a leather cord. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every feather detailed and lifelike. It's beautiful, Astrid breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Did you make this? Ragnar nodded. I've been working on it for weeks, during the evenings when I couldn't sleep. The raven is Odin's messenger, a symbol of wisdom and protection. I want you to wear it while I'm gone, to remember that I'm thinking of you, that I'm fighting to return to you. Astrid felt tears well up in her eyes as she carefully fastened the pendant around her neck. I'll wear it every day, she promised, and I'll pray to whatever gods will listen to bring you back safely. They held each other close, neither wanting to acknowledge that this might be the last time they stood together like this. Finally, Ragnar pulled back and kissed her forehead gently. I love you, Astrid, he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of absolute truth. I know it's soon, and perhaps I shouldn't say it yet, but I need you to know before I leave. Whatever happens, I want you to know that you've brought light back into my life, and I love you for it. I love you too, Astrid replied, the words coming easily because they were true. Come back to me, Ragnar. Promise me you'll come back. I promise, he said again, as he had promised before. I will return to you, and we will build the life we've talked about. This I swear on my honor, on my life, on everything I hold sacred. They kissed one final time, pouring all their love and hope and fear into that moment of connection. Then, reluctantly, they walked back to the settlement, hand in hand, treasuring these last hours together before dawn would take him away. Dawn broke gray and cold over the settlement, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Astrid stood among the crowd gathered at the shore, watching as the warriors made their final preparations for departure. There were 3 longships in total, their dragon-head prows pointed toward the open sea, their hulls loaded with weapons, supplies, and provisions for the journey ahead. Nearly 60 warriors would be sailing, including Eric himself, Ragnar, and the ambitious young Sven. The air was thick with emotion as families said their goodbyes. Wives clung to husbands, mothers embraced sons, children cried as fathers lifted them one last time before boarding the ships. Astrid watched it all with a heavy heart, her hand unconsciously reaching up to touch the raven pendant that hung around her neck beneath her cloak. Ragnar approached her through the crowd, fully armed and armored, his shield strapped to his back, his sword hanging at his side. He looked every inch the fearsome warrior, but when his eyes met Astrid's, they softened with an emotion that was meant only for her. This is it, he said quietly, taking her hands in his. I'll be back as soon as I can. Remember what I said. Wait for me. I will, Astrid promised, fighting to keep her voice steady. Be safe, Ragnar. Be smart. Come home to me. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture both tender and restrained, appropriate for their public setting. I love you, he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. I love you too, she whispered back, squeezing his hands tightly. Then Eric's voice boomed across the shore, calling the warriors to board the ships. Ragnar released Astrid's hands and turned toward the vessels, joining the stream of men climbing aboard. Astrid watched as he took his place among the rowers, his movements efficient and practiced. She saw Sven board as well, laughing loudly with his companions, apparently without a care in the world. The ships were pushed off from the shore, and the warriors began to row, their movements synchronized, powerful. Astrid stood with Hilda and the other women, watching as the longships grew smaller and smaller, their striped sails unfurling as they caught the wind and headed out to sea. She kept her eyes fixed on Ragnar's ship until it was nothing more than a distant speck on the horizon, and even then she continued to stare, as if by sheer force of will she could keep him safe. Come, dear, Hilda said gently, placing a hand on Astrid's shoulder. There's nothing more we can do now but wait and pray. Let's go back to the warmth. Reluctantly, Astrid allowed herself to be led away from the shore. The settlement felt strangely empty with so many of the warriors gone, quieter and somehow more vulnerable. The women who remained threw themselves into work, keeping busy to avoid dwelling on their worries. Astrid did the same, helping Hilda with various tasks, assisting other women with their chores, and trying to keep her mind occupied. But at night, alone in her small room at Hilda's dwelling, her mind would fill with images of Ragnar in battle, of swords clashing and shields splintering, of blood and death and all the terrible things that could happen. She would clutch the raven pendant and pray to gods she wasn't sure existed, begging them to keep him safe, to bring him back to her. The days stretched into weeks with no word from the raiding party. This was normal, Hilda assured her. Raiders could be gone for weeks or even months, depending on how the raid went and what opportunities presented themselves. But the lack of information was agonizing, and Astrid found herself constantly watching the horizon, hoping to see the familiar sight of dragonhead prows returning home. During this time, Astrid grew closer to the other women of the settlement, particularly those whose husbands or sons had sailed with the raid. They formed a silent sisterhood of worry, supporting each other through the anxious waiting. Astrid learned more about the settlement's history, about past raids both successful and disastrous, about the women who had lost their men and the women who had welcomed them home, victorious. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the ships had departed, Astrid was at the market purchasing vegetables when she overheard two merchants talking in low voices. They were discussing rumors that had reached the settlement from traders who traveled the coast, whispers of a major battle to the west, of heavy losses on both sides. Astrid's blood ran cold, and she quickly approached them. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "What were you saying about a battle to the west?" The merchants exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. "Just rumors, mistress," one of them said. "Travelers' tales. You know how such things get exaggerated." "Please," Astrid pressed. "Tell me what you heard." The older of the two merchants sighed. "A trader came through yesterday from the western settlements. He said there had been a raid on one of the fortified villages there, that the defenders fought back fiercely. There were casualties on both sides, he said, though he didn't have specific details. Like I said, just rumors. Could be nothing to do with our men at all. But Astrid knew in her gut that it did have to do with their men. The settlement to the west that Eric had targeted was known to be well defended. This had to be their raid. Did the trader say anything else? About who won? About survivors? The merchant shook his head. Nothing specific. Just that it was a bloody fight. I'm sorry, mistress. I wish I had better information to give you. Astrid thanked him numbly and returned to Hilda's dwelling, her mind racing with fear and dread. She found Hilda and told her what she had heard, and the older woman's face grew grave. We shouldn't panic based on rumors, Hilda said, though Astrid could hear the worry in her voice. But we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that not all our men will return. That's the hard truth of this life, Astrid. We love warriors, and warriors face death. All we can do is hope and wait. The waiting became even more unbearable after that. Every day, Astrid would walk to the shore and scan the horizon, looking for ships. Every night, she would lie awake imagining the worst, then forcing herself to think of better outcomes. Ragnar was skilled, experienced, cautious. He would survive. He had to survive. He had promised. 4 weeks after the raid had departed, a shout went up from the watchtower. "Ships approaching from the west." The entire settlement erupted into activity, people rushing toward the shore to see if their loved ones were returning. Astrid ran with them, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. As she reached the beach, she could see 3 ships on the horizon, their dragon heads unmistakable. They were coming home. But as the ships drew closer, Astrid's relief began to turn to dread. Something was wrong. The ships were riding lower in the water than they should be, and she could see that they were damaged, their sails torn, their sides showing evidence of repair, and there seemed to be fewer men visible on the decks than had departed. The first ship scraped onto the shore, and warriors began disembarking. Many of them were wounded, sporting bandages and walking with limps. The crowd surged forward, families searching frantically for their loved ones. Astrid pushed through, her eyes scanning desperately for Ragnar's tall form, his dark hair, his familiar face. She saw Eric stepping off the lead ship, his expression grim, a bandage wrapped around his head. She saw Leif, Hilda's husband, limping but alive, immediately embraced by his tearful wife. She saw other familiar faces, some whole, some wounded, some bearing expressions of deep grief. But she didn't see Ragnar. Panic began to claw at her chest as the second ship landed and more warriors disembarked. Still no Ragnar. The third ship, the one Ragnar had boarded, finally reached the shore. Astrid watched with mounting terror as men climbed out, many of them helping wounded comrades. She saw several bodies being carried off the ship, wrapped in cloth, and her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Then, finally, she saw him. Ragnar emerged from the ship, supporting another warrior who could barely walk. His face was drawn and exhausted, there was dried blood on his armor, and he moved with a stiffness that suggested injury. But he was alive. He was alive. Astrid didn't remember running to him, didn't remember pushing through the crowd, but suddenly she was there, and he was looking at her with eyes that held both relief and profound sorrow. He carefully transferred the wounded warrior to another man's care, then turned fully to Astrid. "You're alive," she gasped, her hands reaching for him, touching his face, his arms, his chest, as if to confirm he was real and solid and truly there. "I'm alive," he confirmed, his voice rough and weary. "I kept my promise. I came back to you." Then she was in his arms, holding him as tightly as she could, and he was holding her just as fiercely despite whatever pain he must be feeling. She could feel him trembling, could hear the ragged edge to his breathing, and she knew that something terrible had happened during the raid. "What happened?" she asked when she could finally speak. "You're hurt, there are so many wounded, and the ships—" "Later," Ragnar said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll tell you everything later. Right now I just need to hold you to remember why I fought so hard to come home." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, while around them, the settlement dealt with the aftermath of the raid. Families reunited with tears of joy or collapsed in grief upon learning of losses. The wounded were helped to the great hall where healers waited to tend to them. The dead were carried to be prepared for burial rites. Eventually, Ragnar pulled back enough to look into Astrid's eyes. "I need to see to my men, help get the wounded settled and the dead honored. But tonight, after everything is done, can I see you? There's so much I need to tell you." "Of course," Astrid said. "I'll be at Hilda's dwelling. Come whenever you're ready." He nodded, pressed a quick kiss to her forehead, then turned to join Eric and the other warriors who were organizing the settlement's response to the raid's aftermath. Astrid watched him go, relief at his survival warring with dread about what he would tell her when they spoke. The day was consumed with tending to the wounded and learning the full cost of the raid. Astrid helped where she could, bringing water and bandages to the healers, comforting women who had lost husbands or sons. She learned that 15 men had been killed in the battle, with another dozen seriously wounded. The raid itself had been partially successful. They had claimed some treasure and supplies, but the cost had been high, higher than Eric had anticipated. As evening fell and the immediate crisis settled into a somber aftermath, Astrid returned to Hilda's dwelling to wait for Ragnar. Hilda was with her husband Leif, tending to his wounds and grateful beyond words that he had survived. Astrid sat by the fire in the main room, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm ale she couldn't bring herself to drink, her mind churning with anxiety about what Ragnar would tell her. When the knock came at the door, she jumped up to answer it. Ragnar stood there, cleaned up now, his wounds freshly bandaged, his face haggard but determined. Astrid invited him in, and they sat together by the fire, Hilda and Leif discreetly retiring to give them privacy. For a long moment, Ragnar just stared into the flames, his jaw working as if he was trying to find the right words. Finally, he began to speak. "The raid went badly from the start," he said quietly. "The settlement we attacked was better prepared than Eric had expected. They had reinforced their defenses, doubled their warriors. It was as if they knew we were coming. We should have retreated, reassessed, but Sven and the younger warriors were eager for glory. They convinced Eric to press the attack." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "I argued against it. I told Eric it was a trap, that we were walking into a slaughter. But Sven called me a coward in front of everyone, questioned my courage, my loyalty. Eric sided with him, perhaps because he felt he couldn't back down without losing face in front of the younger warriors." Astrid reached for Ragnar's hand, and he gripped it like a lifeline. "We attacked at dawn. The fighting was fierce, brutal. The defenders were well-trained and well-armed. For every man we killed, we lost one of our own. Sven fought like a berserker, with no strategy, no caution, just rage and ambition. He cut through enemies, yes, but he also left his flanks exposed, endangered the men around him." Ragnar's voice grew hoarse with emotion. "I was trying to hold the line, trying to keep our formation together, when I saw Sven get surrounded. 3 of their warriors were about to cut him down. I should have let them. He had brought this disaster upon us with his arrogance and recklessness, but I couldn't. He was one of our own, however foolish. So I fought my way to him, killed 2 of the enemy warriors, and drove off the 3rd. I saved his life." "You were wounded doing it," Astrid observed, seeing the way he favored his left side. "A sword got past my guard, cut deep into my ribs," Ragnar confirmed. "But I survived. We all survived that charge, though barely. Eventually, we managed to break through to their storage buildings, claimed what treasure we could, and fought our way back to the ships. 15 good men died in that raid, Astrid. 15 warriors who trusted Eric's leadership and paid for it with their lives. And for what? Some silver, some supplies, nothing worth the cost we paid." The bitterness in his voice was profound, and Astrid could see the weight of grief and guilt he carried. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "You did everything you could. You tried to warn them, tried to prevent the disaster, and then fought to protect your brothers in arms even when they didn't deserve it. I know, Ragnar said, though he didn't sound convinced, but knowing it intellectually doesn't make it easier to accept. Those men are dead, their families are grieving, and nothing can change that. They sat in silence for a while, Ragnar processing his trauma, while Astrid simply held his hand, offering what comfort she could through her presence. Eventually he spoke again, his voice softer now. There was a moment during the worst of the fighting when I thought I wasn't going to make it back. I was surrounded, wounded, exhausted, and I could feel death reaching for me. But then I thought of you, of your face, of the promise I made to return, and somehow I found the strength to keep fighting, to cut my way free and get back to the ships. You saved my life, Astrid, even though you were hundreds of miles away. The thought of you, the love I feel for you, that's what kept me alive. Tears streamed down Astrid's face as she listened to his words. She moved closer to him on the bench, careful of his injured side, and rested her head against his shoulder. "I'm so glad you came back," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." "You would have survived," Ragnar said with certainty. "You're strong, Astrid, stronger than you know, but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. I'm grateful we both get to keep our promises to each other." They sat together by the fire for hours, talking quietly about the raid, about the men who had been lost, about the future that lay ahead of them. Ragnar told her that Eric had been humbled by the losses, had privately admitted that he should have listened to Ragnar's counsel. Sven, remarkably, had also approached Ragnar earlier that evening, grudgingly thanking him for saving his life and acknowledging that his arrogance had nearly gotten them all killed. "Will things change now?" Astrid asked. "Will Eric be more cautious in the future?" "I hope so," Ragnar replied. "This raid was a harsh lesson, but perhaps a necessary one. We'll see what comes of it." As the night grew late, Ragnar finally stood to leave, wincing at the movement. "I should go. I need to rest. Let my wounds heal. But Astrid, now that I'm back, now that we've both kept our promises, I want to ask you something." Astrid stood as well, her heart beginning to beat faster. "What is it?" Ragnar took both her hands in his storm-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "You've had time while I was gone to think about what you want, to consider your future as a free woman. I told you I would court you properly when I returned, and I intend to keep that promise. But I need to know, Astrid, do you still want this? Do you still want me? Because if you do, I want to marry you as soon as it can be arranged. I don't want to waste another moment of the life we could have together." Astrid felt joy bloom in her chest, so powerful and overwhelming that she could barely breathe. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, I want this. I want you." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Ragnar's face broke into a smile, genuine and radiant, transforming his usually stern features into something beautiful. He pulled her into his arms, careful of his injuries, and kissed her with a passion and tenderness that made her forget everything else, all the pain and fear and uncertainty. In that moment, there was only the two of them, their love, and the future they would build together. The days following Ragnar's return were filled with both mourning and celebration. The settlement held funeral rites for the 15 warriors who had fallen, honoring their bravery and sending them to the afterlife with the respect they deserved. Astrid stood beside Ragnar during the ceremonies, her hand clasped in his, offering silent support as he grieved for the brothers in arms he had lost. The pyres burned high into the night sky, their smoke carrying prayers and farewells to the gods, while the gathered crowd sang songs of valor and remembrance. But even as the settlement mourned its losses, there was also joy to be found in the survivors' return. Families reunited, wounds began to heal, and life slowly returned to its normal rhythms. And in the midst of it all, Ragnar and Astrid began planning their wedding. The announcement of their intention to marry was met with widespread approval throughout the settlement. Hilda was overjoyed, immediately volunteering to help Astrid prepare for the ceremony. Eric gave his blessing, clearly pleased that one of his most trusted warriors had found happiness. Even Leif, recovering from his own wounds, expressed his support, telling Ragnar that he had chosen well. Sven's reaction was perhaps the most surprising. The young warrior approached Ragnar one afternoon as he was working on repairs to his dwelling, preparing it for Astrid's arrival as his wife. Astrid was there as well, helping to clean and organize, and she watched with curiosity as Sven walked up, his expression unusually humble. "Ragnar," Sven said, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "May I speak with you?" Ragnar set down the wooden beam he had been working with and nodded. "Of course." Sven glanced at Astrid, then back to Ragnar. "I wanted to apologize properly this time for my behavior before the raid and during it. You were right about everything. The raid was more dangerous than I understood, and my arrogance put lives at risk. You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die, and I won't forget that. I also wanted to apologize for the disrespectful things I said about Astrid at the feast. She's clearly a woman of worth, and you're fortunate to have found each other." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Ragnar's expression softened. "I accept your apology, Sven. We all make mistakes, especially when we're young and eager to prove ourselves. What matters is that you learn from them and become wiser. The raid taught you hard lessons, but you survived to apply them. That's more than many can say." Sven nodded, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, and congratulations on your upcoming marriage. I hope you'll both be very happy." After Sven left, Astrid moved to stand beside Ragnar, slipping her hand into his. "That was unexpected," she said. "Do you think he's truly changed?" "Time will tell," Ragnar replied. "But I think the raid shook him, made him realize that there's more to being a warrior than just courage and aggression. Perhaps he'll become the man he has the potential to be. I hope so, for his sake and for the sake of the men who'll fight beside him in the future." The wedding was planned for 2 weeks hence, giving them time to make proper preparations, while also allowing Ragnar's wounds to heal sufficiently. During those 2 weeks, Astrid threw herself into the work of preparing for her new life with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. She worked with Hilda and the other women to sew a new dress for the ceremony, a beautiful garment of deep blue wool with intricate embroidery at the neck and sleeves, far finer than anything she had owned before. Ragnar, meanwhile, worked on making his dwelling ready for them to share as husband and wife. He built a larger sleeping platform, crafted new furniture, and made repairs that he had long neglected. Astrid helped when she could, and they spent many happy hours working side by side, talking and laughing, imagining the life they would build together in this space. One afternoon, as they were hanging newly woven tapestries on the walls, Ragnar paused in his work and looked at Astrid with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about your father," he said carefully. Astrid's hands stilled on the tapestry she was adjusting. She hadn't thought much about Bjorn in recent weeks, had been too consumed with her own happiness to dwell on the past. "What about him?" she asked, her voice neutral. "He doesn't know that you're free now, that you're about to be married," Ragnar said. "I was wondering if you wanted to send him word, let him know how your life has turned out, or even invite him to the wedding if you wish." The suggestion stirred complicated emotions in Astrid. Part of her wanted her father to know that she had not only survived, but thrived, that she had found love and freedom despite his betrayal. But another part of her wanted nothing to do with him, wanted to leave that painful chapter of her life firmly in the past. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm still so angry at him for what he did, for selling me to pay his debts. And yet, he's still my father. I think of my mother and brothers sometimes, wonder how they're faring." Ragnar moved to stand beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. If you want to reach out to them, we can send a messenger. If you'd rather leave the past behind and focus on our future, that's fine too. This is your choice, Astrid." Astrid thought about it for several days, weighing her options, examining her feelings. Finally, she made her decision. She would send word to her family about her freedom and upcoming marriage, not as an invitation, but simply as information they deserved to have. She didn't want her father at her wedding, didn't want to see his face on what should be the happiest day of her life. But she wanted him to know that she had survived, that she had found happiness despite what he had done. It was a small victory, perhaps, but it mattered to her. A messenger was dispatched with a simple letter that Astrid had dictated to one of the settlement's scribes. It told her family of her freedom, of Ragnar's honorable treatment of her, and of their upcoming marriage. It assured her mother and brothers that she was well and content, and it said nothing at all about forgiveness, because Astrid wasn't sure she was ready to offer that yet. As the wedding day approached, the settlement buzzed with excitement. Weddings were always occasions for celebration, and the union of one of Eric's most respected warriors with a woman who had won the community's affection was particularly noteworthy. Preparations were made for a feast, with Eric himself contributing generously to ensure it would be a memorable occasion. The night before the wedding, Astrid stayed with Hilda one last time, the two women talking late into the night about marriage, love, and the future. Hilda shared wisdom from her own years of marriage, offering advice both practical and emotional. She spoke of the importance of communication, of patience, of maintaining one's own identity, even while building a life with another person. "Marriage isn't always easy," Hilda said, her expression serious. "There will be hard times, disagreements, moments when you wonder if you've made the right choice. But if you've chosen the right partner, someone who respects you and values you, then you can weather those storms together. And from what I've seen of you and Ragnar, you have something special, something worth fighting for." "I know," Astrid said softly. "I never expected to find this kind of love, especially not under these circumstances. When I first came here, I thought my life was over, that I would never be happy again. But Ragnar showed me that even in the darkest situations, hope can survive. He saw me as a person when he could have seen me as property. He gave me freedom when he could have kept me bound. He loved me when I thought I was unlovable. How could I not love him in return?" Hilda smiled warmly, reaching across to squeeze Astrid's hand. "You deserve this happiness, dear. You've earned it through your strength and resilience. Tomorrow you'll begin a new chapter of your life, and I couldn't be happier for you." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, a rare gift of good weather in the unpredictable northern climate. Astrid woke early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Hilda helped her bathe and dress in her new gown, arranging her honey-colored hair in an elaborate braided style and adorning it with small flowers that had been carefully preserved for the occasion. Around her neck, Astrid wore the raven pendant Ragnar had given her, a symbol of their journey together. When she was finally ready, Hilda stepped back to admire her work. "You look beautiful, Astrid." "Ragnar is a very fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Astrid replied, though her smile suggested she understood they were both lucky to have found each other. The ceremony was to take place in the Great Hall, with Eric presiding as Jarl and the entire settlement in attendance. As Astrid walked from Hilda's dwelling to the hall, accompanied by Hilda and several other women, she was overwhelmed by the well-wishes and congratulations called out by people she passed. These were her people now, her community, and their genuine happiness for her made her heart swell with gratitude. Inside the Great Hall, benches had been arranged to create an aisle leading to the front, where Eric stood waiting. The hall was packed with people, all dressed in their finest clothes, the air buzzing with anticipation. And there, standing near Eric, was Ragnar. He wore a tunic of rich burgundy, embroidered with silver thread, over which he had donned a fine cloak, fastened with an ornate silver brooch. His dark hair had been carefully groomed, his beard neatly trimmed, and around his waist he wore a belt with an impressive buckle that marked his status as one of Eric's warriors. But it was his face that captured Astrid's attention, the way his eyes lit up when he saw her, the smile that transformed his usually stern features into something radiant and joyful. As Astrid walked down the aisle toward him, she felt as if she were floating, the reality of the moment almost too wonderful to believe. This was happening. She was marrying Ragnar, the man who had shown her kindness when he could have shown her cruelty, who had respected her when others would have used her, who had loved her when she thought herself unworthy of love. When she reached the front of the hall, Ragnar took her hand, his grip warm and strong and steady. They turned to face Eric together, their fingers intertwined, ready to make the vows that would bind their lives together. Eric's voice rang out clear and strong as he began the ceremony. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ragnar Eriksson and Astrid Bjornsdottir, to join them in marriage according to our laws and customs. This is a sacred bond, one that should not be entered into lightly but with full understanding of the commitment it requires." He turned to Ragnar. "Ragnar, do you take Astrid as your wife, to honor and protect, to cherish and respect, to stand beside through all the challenges life may bring, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ragnar said, his voice strong and certain, his eyes never leaving Astrid's face. "I pledge myself to her completely, with all that I am and all that I have. She is my partner, my equal, my love, and I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of her." Eric nodded, then turned to Astrid. "Astrid, do you take Ragnar as your husband, to honor and support, to cherish and respect, to stand beside through all the challenges life may bring, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Astrid said, her voice clear despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I pledge myself to him completely, with all that I am and all that I have. He is my partner, my equal, my love, and I will spend the rest of my life building a future worthy of us both. Eric smiled, clearly moved by the sincerity of their vows. Then by the authority vested in me as Jarl, and witnessed by all gathered here, I declare you husband and wife. May the gods bless your union and grant you long life, prosperity, and happiness together. Ragnar pulled Astrid into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, filled with all the love and promise of their future together. The hall erupted in cheers and applause, the sound deafening and joyful. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling so broadly their faces hurt, their eyes shining with happy tears. The feast that followed was magnificent, with tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables, fruits, and seemingly endless supplies of ale and mead. Music filled the hall as musicians played traditional songs, and people danced and celebrated late into the night. Astrid and Ragnar sat at the place of honor, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers, their hands never far from each other, constantly touching, reassuring themselves that this was real. Leif stood and offered a toast. To Ragnar and Astrid, may their love be as strong as Ragnar's sword arm. May their home be filled with laughter and warmth, and may they have many years together to build the life they deserve. The hall roared its approval, cups raised high, and Astrid felt tears of joy streaming down her face. She looked at Ragnar and found him watching her with such love and adoration that it took her breath away. "Are you happy?" he asked softly, leaning close so she could hear him over the noise of the celebration. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Astrid replied honestly. "When I first came here, I thought my life was ending, but it was actually beginning. You gave me hope when I had none, freedom when I thought I would never be free, and love when I believed I was unlovable. How could I not be happy?" Ragnar lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You gave me hope too, Astrid. You reminded me that life could hold joy and purpose beyond just fighting and surviving. You brought light back into a heart I thought was permanently darkened. I love you more than I have words to express." As the feast continued around them, they sat together, wrapped in their own private world of love and contentment. Eventually, as tradition dictated, they were escorted by the wedding party to Ragnar's dwelling, now theirs to share. The crowd sang bawdy songs and offered good-natured teasing, but it was all done with affection and celebration. When the door finally closed behind them and they were alone at last, Ragnar and Astrid stood in the center of their home, simply looking at each other, almost overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "We're married," Astrid said, as if testing the words, making them real. "We're married," Ragnar confirmed, pulling her close. "You're my wife, and I'm your husband, and we have the rest of our lives to figure out what that means together." They made love that night with tenderness and passion, celebrating their union and the love that had brought them to this moment. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, Astrid reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. She had been given to a Viking warrior as punishment for her father's sins, arriving at this settlement as a slave with no hope for the future. But that Viking warrior had seen her worth, had treated her with respect and kindness, had fallen in love with her as she had fallen in love with him. He had given her freedom, and in doing so, had given her the greatest gift of all, the choice to love him freely and completely. In the weeks and months that followed, Astrid and Ragnar built a life together that was everything they had hoped for and more. They worked side by side, maintaining their household, contributing to the settlement's prosperity. Ragnar continued to serve Eric as a warrior and advisor, his counsel now given even more weight after the lessons of the disastrous raid. Astrid became a respected member of the community, her intelligence and capability earning her a voice in the women's councils and the trust of her neighbors. They faced challenges, as all married couples do. There were disagreements and difficult moments, times when Ragnar's duties as a warrior took him away from home and Astrid had to manage alone. But they faced these challenges together, with honesty and communication, always remembering the love that had brought them together and the commitment they had made to each other. A year after their wedding, Astrid gave birth to their first child, a strong, healthy son they named Eric, in honor of the Jarl who had brought them together, however inadvertently. Ragnar wept when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude. Astrid watched her husband cradle their child with such tenderness and love, and she knew without doubt that she had found exactly where she belonged. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Astrid would think about her father and the choice he had made that had set all of this in motion. She had received word back from her family after sending her letter. Her mother had written to say how relieved and happy she was to hear of Astrid's good fortune, and even Bjorn had included a brief note expressing his gladness that things had worked out well for her. Astrid had not responded, still not ready to fully forgive, but she had kept the letter, acknowledging that perhaps someday the wound would heal enough for reconciliation. But whether or not she ever forgave her father, Astrid had long since stopped dwelling on the past. She had a future now, a beautiful, bright future with a man who loved her deeply, and a son who would grow up knowing he was cherished. She had freedom, respect, purpose, and love. She had everything she had once thought impossible. One evening, as she and Ragnar sat outside their dwelling watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms, Ragnar spoke quietly. "Do you ever regret how we came together? Do you wish things had been different, that we had met under better circumstances?" Astrid considered the question seriously before answering. "I won't lie and say I don't wish my father had been a better man, that I hadn't had to experience the pain of his betrayal. But do I regret the path that led me to you? No, never. Because that path, difficult as it was, brought me to this moment, to this life, to this love, and I wouldn't trade that for anything." Ragnar smiled and pulled her close, careful not to disturb their sleeping son. "I feel the same way. You were given to me as punishment for your father's mistakes, but loving you has been the greatest blessing of my life. You are my gift, Astrid, my treasure, my heart, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life thanking whatever gods or fate brought you to me." As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Astrid leaned into her husband's embrace, their son safe between them, and felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had been given to a Viking warrior as her father's punishment, but that warrior had loved her like no one else ever had or ever would, and in his love, she had found not just survival, but a life worth living, a happiness worth celebrating, and a future worth building together. Their story, which had begun in darkness and despair, had blossomed into light and love. And as they sat together watching the stars emerge one by one, Astrid knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, bound by a love that had been tested and proven true, a love that would endure for all the days of their lives.